So good evening to our audience in Poland. Good afternoon to our guests from the United States. I am pleased to welcome you to the next lecture in Sołek Natural Law lecture series. And our guest today is Dan Sheffler, professor of philosophy at Memorial College and associated scholar at the Hildebrand Project. Our guest graduated with a PhD from the University of Kentucky in 2007. His doctoral dissertation concerned Plato's concept of the personhood, and Professor Sheffler specializes in the history of ideas, especially the history of concept of personhood. He is also interested in the history of the Platonic tradition, the personalism of Dietrich von Hildebrand, classical education, and topics such as beauty, virtue, truth, education, and sanctity. And the topic of our lecture is personality and sanctity. Dietrich von Hildebrand on the liturgy. Professor Sheffler, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm very glad to be speaking with you all today, and I hope you enjoy this paper, which is based on Dietrich von Hildebrand's Liturgy and Personality that we were just talking about before we got started here, and I'm pleased to learn is somewhat recently translated into Polish. So I commend that to your all's attention, and I hope you enjoy that book. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that you can follow along with what I'm reading. This is a paper that I haven't yet submitted to a journal, but I hope will become a journal article. And so perhaps in the Q&A, you guys can give me some good feedback and places where I might be able to adjust or expand some sections here. But I hope you enjoy. So I'll begin. In Liturgy and Personality, Dietrich von Hildebrand argues that the liturgy of the Church provides an invaluable context within which we can come awake to the value of the sacred, respond to this value, and thereby mature into the fullness of personality. This account offers us a rich explanation of the dynamics that occur between the exterior richness of the sacred on the object side and the interior expansion that we undergo on the subject side. While we are a, quote, person from the first moment of our conception, we grow into a full, quote, personality, according to Hildebrand, as we respond along with the communion of the saints in worship. In this account, however, Hildebrand moves between the classical human virtues that make someone a personality, a notion which is the same for all of us, and the, quote, unduplicable thought of God, which we embody in our own personality. While I do not think Hildebrand is at all confused on this point, I suspect that his readers might be. Hence, I will offer a clarification of terms and argue that a person's growth as a saint in response to the sacred develops not just those features of his personhood that he shares with all persons, but those features of his irreplaceable personality that make him this personal someone. So in the first section, what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay out my proposed terminology as distinct from Hildebrand's as a clarification of terms. And then in the second section, I will outline Hildebrand's work himself, and hopefully the bridge between those two will become clear. I want to begin by making a three-way distinction in place of a two-way distinction in Hildebrand. Hence, where Hildebrand would distinguish person from personality, I would distinguish three things. One, personhood, referring to those ontological features in virtue of which someone is a someone rather than merely something. For example, rationality or the capacity for moral agency. Two, personal identity, referring to those features of someone that distinguish him from all other persons as a unique someone in an incommunicable manner. And three, personality, referring to the full development of the features in both 1 and 2 into the maturity that we experience now to a degree, but ultimately is only brought to full perfection in the eschaton. It will be helpful before we move on to what Hildebrand has to say about holiness and personality to draw out a few implications that follow from this three-part distinction and clarify a few potential mistakes. In the above sense, personhood is common and shared, while personal identity is not. Both Peter and Paul are individual substances of a rational nature. Both possess free will or the dignity proper to personal moral agents or whatever else we want to say are the distinguishing features of persons as opposed to things. Such an ontological basis sets Peter and Paul apart from trees and rocks, but does not distinguish between Peter and Paul. Such features tell us what we are as persons, but they do not tell us who we are as this person. Granted, a particular instance of a general feature such as rationality as an instance is a particular instance metaphysically distinct from other instances. So Peter's rationality is metaphysically distinct from Paul's, just as Peter's animality is metaphysically distinct from Paul's. Nevertheless, when we identify the unique and irreplaceable character of Peter's personal identity, we are identifying more than the metaphysical uniqueness that a particular pebble has, mysterious and wonderful as the pebble's particularity may be in its own right. This distinction between personhood and personal identity may lead our minds toward those features of Peter that make him stand out from others in our experience. His brashness, his all too ready devotion to our Lord, his bearded visage. But this would be a mistake. In the first place, such qualitative features are, in principle, shareable with others. As the scholastics say, they are communicabilis. While Peter's brashness makes him stand out from the crowd, other persons can be brash too. If the brashness were what made Peter Peter, then the others would be just as much Peter as he. Indeed, if they were more brash, they would be more Peter than Peter. We might appeal to the idea that it is not just the brashness alone, but the combination of brashness and beard, and perhaps many other qualitative traits. But such a scheme would turn Peter into nothing more than an aggregate of communicable traits, even if we found some reason to think that the aggregate as a whole would be unique. Just a footnote, we were talking about Numenius when we were doing our mic check, and this account of personal identity, we find something like it in Porphyry, and it may have an antecedent in Numenius. So just a little footnote there. Understanding Peter's identity in terms of his striking features or idiosyncrasies faces an even graver problem, however. Peter was not always brash. He was not always bearded, and we do not know whether he will retain these qualities in the future. From the moment of his conception, Peter was Peter, an irreplaceable person loved by God as this unique beloved. Hence, Peter's personal identity cannot depend on these acquired features, And while it may depend ontologically on those features we previously identified as essential to his personhood, it cannot be wholly constituted by them. Instead, we are left with a mysterious remainder, a dimension that goes beyond those features shared by Peter and Paul, yet prior to those features that Peter acquires in the course of his life. In the dark of those first hours as an embryo, Peter is already endowed by God with the dignity of personhood, but he is also endowed with the dignity of being Peter. And the exact character of that dignity in those dark hours can be known only to the one who granted it. But this is not the end of the story. From the first moments of his life, Peter also receives a call. He does not remain an embryo, and his destiny is more than the bare fact of his personhood or even the bare fact of his unique personal identity, wonderful as these may be. Hence, if I may be allowed to put it this way, we may distinguish between the Peterness as an endowment and his Peterness as an achievement, as he lives up to the unique call placed upon his life. Notice that the former is not something that he could fail to receive or ever lose, but the latter is something that he must live up to through his free moral agency as he cooperates with grace. This latter full development of all that it means to be Peter is what I will call his personality. And we will need to distinguish between this and the sense of classical personality that Hildebrand has in mind in the passages we will examine. Now, the concept of Peter becoming Peter in this last sense is not the same concept as Peter becoming a saint, at least not in an obvious way. But the connection between the one and the other is rich, as C.S. Lewis famously remarks in Mere Christianity. It is no good trying to, quote, be myself without him, that is, Christ. The more I resist him and try to live on my own, the more I become dominated by my own heredity and upbringing and surroundings and natural desires. In fact, what I so proudly call myself becomes merely the meeting place for trains of events which I never started and which I cannot stop. What I call my wishes become merely the desires thrown up by my physical organism or pumped into me by other men's thoughts or even suggested to me by devils. Until you have given yourself to him, you will not have a real self. Sameness is to be found amongst the most natural men, not amongst those who surrender to Christ. How monotonously alike all the great tyrants and conquerors have been. How gloriously different are the saints. Responding to the holiness of God and thereby growing in holiness ourselves is the surest way to grow into the fullness of our own personality. By contrast, responding to our impulses, passions, and pride leads to a loss of personality, although our most fierce rebellion can never utterly erase that kernel of personal dignity with which we are endowed by sheer grace from the beginning. What Lewis leaves in the background, but what I hope to draw from Hildebrand, however, is the way that holiness before us, that is, in front of us, precedes holiness within us. Coming into the presence of the sacred and responding to its essential character is a crucial condition antecedent to the development of full personality. We must go to church to grow up. Your personality is classical. Now we move to Hildebrand. Turning to liturgy and personality, we find Hildebrand making the case that responding to the sacred, specifically in the liturgy of the Mass and divine office, is an indispensable component of growing up into the full-fledged personality that God intends for us. He begins by drawing a distinction between person and personality, similar to the distinction I made above. In speaking of personality as distinct from the person, we have in mind something clearly defined. Every man is a person in that his being is essentially conscious, and he is a subject who enters into relations with others, and who knows, wills, and loves. A person is a being who possesses himself, who does not simply exist, but who actively achieves his being and has the power to choose freely. This is what I called personhood above. But every man is not a personality. Only persons can be personalities, but in order to be a personality, it is not enough just to be a person. We should note that under Hildebrand's term person, he understands both categories 1 and 2 that I have above called personhood and personal identity. It is worth calling attention to this in order to avert a possible confusion as he explains further what he means by personality. A personality in the true sense of the word is the man who rises above the average only because he fully realizes the classical human attitudes, because he knows more deeply and originally than the average man, loves more profoundly and authentically, wills more clearly and correctly than the others, makes full use of his freedom. In a word, the complete, the profound, true man. Notice in this explanation, he does not emphasize the process of Peter living up to his unique Peterness, but rather the process of living up to the classical human attitudes of knowing, loving, and willing, a task we all have in common. While it is surely not what Hildebrand has in mind, one might worry that as each of us becomes more and more, quote, classical, we look more and more like one another, little by little merging into that pure marble face of one and the same Greek statue. Nevertheless, I will argue that this is precisely the opposite of what happens. As we become more of a personality, in Hildebrand's sense, we grow more fully into our personality in the sense I defined above. The more we develop the classical virtues, the more our unique personality is brought to maturity and fullness. As Hildebrand puts it, dying to oneself does not, however, mean the giving up of individuality. On the contrary, the more a man becomes, quote, another Christ, the more he realizes the original, unduplicable thought of God which he embodies. This claim introduces us to a further observation. Before we ever began to develop our personality, the content of that personality is already given in the mind of God. As Alexander Montes has beautifully elaborated, we learn from the revelation of St. John that God calls each of us by a secret name written on a little white stone. Living up to all that this call requires, however, means that we must realize this unduplicable thought of God through our free moral agency. There's an element of contingency here because we may, and often do, fail to live up to this call. But our personality is not contingent in the way that many imagine. I am not free to tell God that what my secret name should be, or dictate to him the content of my unique call. It may be interesting to speculate about the ways God could eternally incorporate into this call elements of our temporal contingent choices through his foreknowledge. But be that as it may, we are still a far cry from the radical freedom to shape our own identity that we find in Nietzsche or Sartre. In Hildebrand's conception, the unduplicable thought of God, which I embody, is an objective reality given to me and to which I am free only to respond or not to respond. So how does this play out? This brings us to the vital interplay between subject and object that plays a central role in the logic of his book, Liturgy and Personality. In order to understand this logic, we should briefly examine the more general framework of value response. For Hildebrand, the world is replete with objective values, including moral values, aesthetic values, intellectual values, and several other kinds. These values stand on the object side of experience, and they merit or call for an adequate response on the subjective side. This adequate response involves first an awakenedness to the existence and meaning of the value, and second, the personal sanctioning of our response, whereby we commit ourselves as moral personal agents. In both steps, all adequate value response involves a deepening of the person, both in the common features of personhood and in the special features of personality. Peter's rationality and moral agency deepens as he responds to values, but he also becomes who he is meant to be in particular. In the first place, awakenedness to value involves the exercise of precisely that mode of consciousness proper to spiritual persons. And the more we come awake in this way, the more this mode of consciousness develops in a manner proper to our very being. I do not simply become more human, however. I also become more myself. As Hildebrand says, one of the deepest marks of the true personality is the state of being spiritually awake. It is my consciousness, my own interior life, that expands as I come awake to the world of values. In the second place, the sanctioning of our value response that we exercise means that we exercise our moral agency in such a way that what we do becomes fully our own action, rather than merely something that merely happens to us or which we experience ourselves merely stumbling through. Quote, "Many people are not blind to values, but they leave it to chance whether or not a value reveals itself and seizes them. They let themselves drift and be carried wherever the stream of circumstances directs their impulses and fleeting moods. They abandon themselves to the law of inertia in their nature. Their life is a perpetual letting oneself go, and hence a life on the periphery. They do not really live their lives, but let themselves, so to speak, undergo their lives. Being awake, however, is the bearing deeply in mind of the fundamental truths once grasped, and above all, the truth of the metaphysical situation of man." That's the phrase metaphysical situation of man. Hildebrand uses that frequently to refer to our basic situation of being a creature before the face of a creator God. On the next page, he says, "An entirely new and decisive degree of awakenedness is implied in the moral consciousness which awakes a man to a fundamentally new understanding of the sphere of values and makes him find himself and his own freedom, which allows him to grasp the fact that only the conscious, expressly sanctioned response to value satisfies the demand of the realm of values." Now, much can be said about the metaphysics of value and value epistemology in play here, and that footnote is to a friend of mine, Martin Kothmal, who just wrote a book on Dietrich von Hildebrand's value epistemology, his moral epistemology, which I highly recommend to you all. And it is important to note again that this deepening of the person, both qua person and qua Peter, applies to all adequate value response. In a special way, however, it applies particularly to the sacred. The values stand in a hierarchy, and we live up to our calling in a higher way when we respond to the higher values. Hildebrand conceives this as a kind of interior expansion of our very self. The more inner room a person reserves for the higher values, not letting himself be submerged by the less important ones, and the more he can actualize new dimensions in his soul when the higher values arise before his spiritual eye, so much more is he a genuine personality. We find the summit of these values as we come awake to the metaphysical situation of man, by which Hildebrand means the situation of man as a spiritual creature before the face of God. It is in this context that the full height and depth of the whole world of values becomes clear. The person no longer responds to the aesthetic value of nature in isolation or to moral value as an impersonal good. Rather, man finds himself confronted face to face. He finds himself in the I-thou space of encounter, addressed by name. Further, he finds that the demands placed upon him by the holiness of God go beyond the virtues of the noble pagans. He sees this sacred quality exhibited by the lives of the saints, which radiate a spiritual richness qualitatively distinct from what we find in a Cato or a Socrates. While the full content of this new quality is only accessible to theology, since it requires the apprehension of special revelation, the qualitative richness of the saints can be felt even by the pagan and is a phenomenological datum accessible to philosophy. The central thesis of Liturgy and Personality is that the liturgy of the Church, especially that of the Mass and the Divine Office, provide an invaluable structure within which this full awakenedness and value response are nourished. In church, I am surrounded by objective holiness. I am given the prayers of the Church, which deeply express this metaphysical situation of man before God. I pray these prayers along with a community of pilgrims on the way to sanctity, and above all, I am present with Christ himself in the Blessed Sacrament. While it may be possible to come awake to the value of the sacred outside this environment, we would be foolish to think that the liturgy of the Church is dispensable or easily replaced by other avenues to the sacred. As we participate in this liturgy day after day, week after week, an interior transformation occurs. The atmosphere of the sacred by which we are surrounded is taken into our lungs. The objective value gets inside. As we pray the prayers of the saints, sing the songs of the saints, journey with the saints, and eat the bread of the saints, we become saints. Importantly, however, we do this not by focusing on our own particular sanctity. As Hildebrand puts it, the prayers of the Church, being the same for everyone, are, quote, supra-individual. In the Holy Mass and in the Divine Office, not only does the we dominate the I, but even when the I is uttered, this I is completely incorporated into the communion. Nevertheless, this supra-individual character of the liturgy does not efface the personality of the participant. Instead, the supra-individual I of the liturgy is uttered in such a way that one's personality is taken up, preserved, and ennobled. The liturgy alone, because of its supra-individual stamp, its all-embracing breadth, never violates man's separate individuality. Each individuality, however strongly expressed, can take part in this supra-individual prayer, and one can take part in it without having to give up or disavow that special secret word that God utters anew to each soul, in that each soul represents a unique, unduplicable design of God. I find it striking that Hildebrand does not say in spite of the liturgy's supra-individual stamp, but rather because of this stamp. The man's separate individuality is protected and indeed brought to full expression. But of course, we find this same striking paradox in the Gospels themselves. Jesus says, quote, "He that findeth his life," which the Greek there is psyche, "shall lose it, and he that shall lose his life," psyche again, "for me shall find it." And the Greek word there is significant because it is often translated as soul, but could be translated as yourself, your personality, who you are. Hence, we can discern an explanation for the observation from C.S. Lewis with which we began. Those who descend into the depths of the passions become more and more similar to one another because their interior lives as spiritual persons become more and more flattened into the shallowness of moral sleepwalking, unsanctioned life. The shallowness and impersonal character on the object side comes to be reflected by a shallowness and withering of personality on the object side. Speaking of the deaf and mute, impersonal and unmoving idols of the Canaanite gods, the psalmist says, quote, "Let them that make them become like unto them, and all such as trust in them." Those, however, who lose themselves in the depth and richness of the sacred come alive as fully awake and fully responsible moral persons. The depth dimension on the object side comes to be reflected by an interior depth dimension on the subject side. And the richness of the value on the object side comes to be reflected by a richness of personality on the subject side. Truly did Lewis say, therefore, how monotonously alike all the great tyrants and conquerors have been. How gloriously different are the saints. All right, there you have it.
Okay, Professor, thank you very much for your interesting lecture, and I would like now to start the discussion. So, who would like to ask the first question?
Is there a chat box? There we go.
Chat.
Okay, Andrzej, would you like to ask our guest?
I'd like to ask one question. This beautiful words about this Catholic liturgy and to be more person when we take part in it. I think really it is true. And I have a question: why are so many? Why we? I think who participate in the mass and other people, why we have so much, why we are not saints, why we have such troubles to change our personality in this way.
Well, that's an easy question. If you'll just follow my my 5-step program, and I'll just charge you $99.95. Just follow my program, and you'll be a saint in 30 days. No, your point is well taken, because of course that is the great struggle. You know, we have the example of others who have gone before us, and we see people are transformed by the liturgy. It has happened. And we believe in faith that objectively there's something going on in the sacraments, whether we feel it in a particular way, or have a certain experience subjectively. Okay, the Blessed Sacrament is objectively the body and blood, soul and divinity of Christ. If it's there, right? The absolution is pronounced in confession. It's there. Okay, but then we come to experience this mismatch. I hear what you're saying between what's going on objectively and our own interior lives, and then our own moral virtue. Now, the first thing that I would say, what I think Hildebrand would say, is that it has to do with this mechanism of sanctioning. Okay, so by that he means that first, as conscious, free, moral agents, we have the ability to understand and see what is going on objectively. Okay, so I can see and understand, for instance, that I should tell the truth, that honesty is good. I can see and understand that Christ is present in the Blessed Sacrament. Okay, and yet it's a second moment after I understand it to be the case, I have to sign on to it, so to speak. I have to sign my name on the dotted line and commit myself personally before I come into alignment with what is there objectively. Okay, and that gap is part of our moral freedom, the gap between seeing the object and subjectively endorsing it, or what Hildebrand calls sanctioning it. And I think most of us struggle to do that because of original sin. And Hildebrand, there's a forthcoming book. We recently discovered some papers in the Nachlass there in, I believe, in Munich. He has in his book, Ethics, there's this question. Okay, well, but why? Why does this happen? Why don't we just see the good and do it? why don't we just become saints? And he has a short section where he says all the various answers to that question come down to pride and concupiscence. And we found some papers recently where it looked like he took that section from the Ethics and he was working on a book before he died. So we're editing that up. I helped edit these papers together, and we're publishing it under the name of The Roots of Moral Evil. And this is his more in-detailed explanation that says, so why do we struggle to sanction the good? Well, it's either pride or concupiscence, and he has a whole catalog of the various ways in which this happens, the varieties of pride and concupiscence. I hope that I addressed your question.
Yes, so we have to struggle.
We have to struggle, yes. and I think that there's sort of two steps. First, you have to actually go to Mass. If you're not there at Mass, then you can't respond to what's at Mass. If you're absent, you can't respond to it. But once you're there, it will do you some objective good. But that objective good is going to be limited if you are not entering in your own interiority, in endorsing it and signing on to it wholeheartedly, agreeing with your will. So the second step, so first go to Mass, but then second participate in Mass. That would be the they answered.
Thank you. And maybe now I would like to ask you. During the lecture, I was thinking about Plato and his tripartite concept of the soul. I mean, rational, logistikon, spiritual, thymoeides, and appetitive, epithemitikon. And these three parts are harmonized by justice, by dikaiosyne. And I would like to ask, what do you think? What would the justice of the soul be in the context of the liturgy, or what is the justice of the soul in the context of the liturgy? Because it seems to me that in this matter we can often encounter two opposite errors. I mean, overestimating the emotions and underestimating the emotions. And maybe does Hildebrand refer to Plato's distinction in his works on the liturgy?
Yes, man. If I had written you ahead of time a question to ask, that would be like the perfect question, and promised to pay you $10 to ask the question. That would be one of the questions that I would come up with. It was a great question, and you're exactly right. So first thing to get straight, just on Plato, is that the appetites in the lowest part of the soul, the epithematikon, those aren't bad, right? So the epithematikon, that is the part of our soul that we share in common with animals. And so we have these basic irrational urges. And when we say irrational, we don't mean stupid, we just mean not rational. Okay, so when our body is depleted of water, we have an urge to drink. When we're cold, we have an urge to get warm. These are not bad. These are in fact good. Okay, but the problem, the lack of dikaiosune, comes when those urges are not organized by to logistikon or nous, the rational part of the soul. Okay, so this has a very nice correspondence to what Hildebrand says about sanctioning that we just went through, that you might have various urges, impulses, instincts. Some of them might be good, some of them might lead you in a bad direction, so you might have the urge to eat. That on its own is not bad. You might have the urge to be kind to other people because you're gregarious and kind of a herd animal. Okay, and so you like being generally friendly. Well, that on its own, of course, is good, but it's not a moral virtue yet, until it has been sanctioned for Hildebrand by your moral agency. So there's a lot of people, to relate this directly to the Mass and to other spiritual practices, that are sort of going through the motions, and maybe they have a lot of good impulses. They kneel at the right time, they say the right thing, they feel, something when the incense comes out, whatever. But they haven't incorporated it into the depth of their personality because it's more happening to them instinctually than what they themselves are doing. Okay, now to the second part of your question, the danger of both overestimating the role of emotions, but also underestimating the role of emotions. Hildebrand has a whole book devoted to this topic that I highly recommend to you guys, called The Heart, in which he argues for restoring affectivity, feeling, to its proper place in our spiritual lives, which is neither the highest place nor is it the lowest place. Okay, and in particular, he argues that love necessarily involves an affective dimension. It has, if we're properly loving one another and ultimately loving God, that comes with a feeling, with an emotive component. Okay, and so those emotions can be trained. There are emotions that you ought to feel, and so maybe you go to Mass and you don't feel the right emotions. And this, I think, is actually part of the equation for what, well, I've been going to Mass. Why aren't I a saint yet? Okay. Part of it is, well, you need to be responding to what's going on at every level of your being. And you can't do that just, snap your fingers and click on the feelings, but you can train yourself to have the right dispositions and the right feelings over time. And back to the Plato tripartite soul, how does that work? Well, it involves putting nous at the top of your personality and organizing everything in your psychology underneath the dominion of your apprehension of the good. Hildebrand, in his Ethics, argues that if a man first makes a fundamental decision for the good, that at rock bottom he wills to be good, without self-deception, without all the trickery we play, that over time the other things will kind of work themselves out. That is really the fundamental thing. There's these other things that have to happen. You have to avail yourself of the sacraments, and you have to do these other things, and you have to be wise and learn things, and you have to learn how to discipline yourself, and you have to do various asceticisms. But at rock bottom, all those other things will happen if you choose above all else good. Okay, if you will to be good, that's the crucial starting point.
Okay, and thank you for your excellent answer. And so maybe someone else would like to ask our guest. Okay, if we don't have any question anymore, so I would like to thank you very much for your excellent lecture and for the answering to our questions. And it was a pleasure to have you as a lecturer, as a guest. Maybe I would like to tell a few words about next meeting. Next meeting will be held on the 10th of February, and our guest will be Professor Enrique Martinez Garcia from Spain. And the topic of the lecture will be Does Nature Exist? Groundwork of the Moral Order and Personal Life. So thank you all for participating in our meeting.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It was a pleasure to get to interact with you guys.